Welcome back, everybody. And just to check that we do have Nicole on the line.
Yes, I'm here. Can everyone hear and see me?
Loud and clear, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us. So, just as a brief introduction, I think I first met Nicole when she was head of the UNPRI, or the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, for not just South Africa. I think it was the entire
Well,
Africa, Nicole.
Africa and the Middle East, yeah.
And what is it for the last 4 years or so?
Yeah, about 3.5, and I'm currently still acting in that role in a part-time capacity.
Okay, no, the one thing I can recall from all our chats over the years is every time I leave this meeting, A, I know how much passion you have for the subject, and B, how much I still have to learn. You really are a wealth of knowledge, and I think in the interest of time, we just pop straight to your presentation, and then I have a couple of questions at the end. So thank you, Nicole.
Great, and thank you so much, David, and thanks to NetGroup for the invitation. We've had a technical glitch, so I'm going to say next slide when I need to change. Just as a brief introduction, my name is Nicole Martens. I'm currently Director of Martens Impact Advisory and the Acting Head of Africa and the Middle East for the United Nations Supported Principles for Responsible Investment. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about ESG in real life. You can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that's come out from the presentations that we've seen this morning, I found it really interesting in that there's been a bit of a golden thread that's run throughout. I mean, Ian was talking about how the recovery from the pandemic is starting to take place, but that recovery looks a bit different from what we're used to. We're not going back to normal, we're going back to a different place entirely. And Bruce was talking about the benefits and the risks of incorporating sustainability into the approach that you take and how that's very clear. And we had Ray talking about the responsibility that comes with the power that you have as an institutional investor, as someone who can direct capital. Also really interesting to have Toby referring to what he's doing as a process of learning, because all of that is very palpable in where we are right now. So not to harp on anything we've covered today, but to just remind us that we are in the process of a global shift. The world as we know it right now is in a transition. And the transition really is focused on shifting from systems focused on exploitation and extraction to those of sustainable and inclusive growth and development. That's why issues like diversity and inclusion become so important at a leadership level. It's not just about growth, it's about inclusive growth, not leaving anyone behind. And that's sort of what you would have heard mentioned earlier when people were talking about a just transition. The transition is happening. We're moving to low carbon economies because we have no choice. The planet is literally on fire. Whether or not that transition is just and fair and inclusive is up to us and the decisions that we make now. This transition that we see is really reflecting an evolution in thinking by policymakers, regulators, industry, and society. It's a much more holistic way of thinking. It's about understanding that what we would have traditionally considered to be non-financial factors actually do have significant financial implication. We had that quote earlier about how you can't operate a business or generate returns in a society that's descended into chaos. That is true in terms of environmental factors, but also in terms of social and other socioeconomic or socio-political factors. We need every part of the system to work effectively in order for us to continue to generate return and grow in perpetuity. Next slide, please. So to make this a little bit more real for us, so I think a lot of the time the conversations we have about this are quite academic or theoretical, and it's useful to just get a sense of what does this mean in real life. So to do so, what I've done is taken just a snapshot of some of the headlines that hit the Financial Times in the last week. And what I'm going to do is just go through what happened and what's the so what of it. Why does it actually matter to us as South African investors, or African investors more broadly, or just members of society? The first one I want to focus on is the fact that in the last week, the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, said that there can be no more oil and gas investments. There can be no investments in new oil and gas if we are to reach net zero by 2050. So why does that matter? The first reason is because it's a global authority that sets a standard for all of the entire industry across the planet. There's no one who's exempt from what the IEA has to say and the standards that they set. The second thing that makes it incredibly relevant, especially for South Africans and the nature of the market for energy in our context, is that the proposal is that there'd be an overhaul of energy supply and demand, with coal demand down by 90%, gas demand down by half, and oil demand down by 75% in the next few years. That presents a major risk to industries in our country and on the continent that are very dependent on those sources of energy. The last one is that there's also an opportunity presented in the form of the need for clean energy investment of up to $5 trillion every year up until 2030. So there's an international headline on something related to climate that has very real implications for us here in the financial services sector. The next one we'll touch on is that the G7 recently said that they will not fund any more new coal in developing markets. Why is that relevant? Well, specifically because South Africa was a special invitee to that meeting. We were specifically invited, even though we're not part of the G7, because the G7 thought it was very important that we heard that. And I think that in and of itself is worth noting. The second part is that there's pressure now from the G7 on countries like South Africa, and also available support for this transition. So the message is clear. It's that we can't carry on like this. If you need help, we can help you, but we need to see that there's commitment that we're going to do this properly. And then the last one, very recently also, that's getting a lot of attention in the press, is that a court in The Hague has recently ordered Shell to decrease its emissions by 45% by 2030. And the reason why that matters is, first and foremost, that it sets a legal precedent for inadequate climate strategy, suggesting not that it's bad business, not that it's unethical, but that it's a direct violation of human rights to not have an adequate climate transition strategy in place. And what that means is that companies with which you're operating as treasurers, companies that Nedbank is funding, Nedbank as a company needs to consider very carefully whether there's potential liability because of your lack of climate strategy. So we know Nedbank is advanced in that space, but it's one of those things when you're operating, when you're talking to your clients, to say, look, you need to have a plan in place for this, not just because it looks good in an integrated report or because it's a good idea, you know, in terms of your conscience, but because if you don't have a plan, you can get sued for human rights violations now. And specifically around the crime that's been described as ecocide, which is a grave crime against humanity in the form of environmental destruction. So there's a massive swell now with this Shell verdict that a bunch of different oil and gas and fossil fuel companies are shaking in their boots, wondering when the case is coming against them. Next slide, please. So closer to home, so those were a couple of really big sort of macro global headlines. What does this look like closer to home? Very specifically, and you'll see from some of the sort of excerpts that I've popped on the slide there, that Africa is particularly vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change. And it's a combination of just our geographic location and characteristics, but also our low adaptive capacity. So we don't have the infrastructure and the systems in place to bounce back from a severe shock. The world is watching South Africa as a proxy for sort of African leadership to see how we adapt, to see what we do, how we adapt to this new normal. And so far, we're not doing very well. Our approach has been described by the sort of assessment bodies that be as highly insufficient, which is not really where we want to be playing. What's happening at the moment is that this fixation on our old ways of doing things is limiting our potential to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented in the new way, in the new normal. And the domestic market is starting to reach the limits of its patience. And we see this in terms of the shareholder resolutions tabled recently at Sasol and Standard Bank, where the domestic market is saying, we are no longer going to accept this. We know that we can do better. And that's why it's super relevant for us. Next slide. To bring it really home, I thought what would be useful is, you know, for the participants in today's workshop to ask yourselves and ask your clients is really just a list of questions that are helpful to get a sense of how far we need to go and you know, what kind of work we should be doing. It starts with understanding, what does this transition mean for your industry or your business? If you can't answer that question, then it's a non-starter. You need to start looking into, what does this actually mean for us? Where do we need to be and by when? And where are we starting? So what is our baseline? How far do we have to cover? How can we get there in the time that we have available? We need to think about how we can communicate to investors, customers, regulators, that we have this in hand, that we know what we need to do and that we have, in fact, intention to get there properly. Investors are increasingly going to be looking not at how do you fare right now, but how are you likely to look in 20 years? And what does that journey look like? We also need to start thinking about the pragmatic strategies for achieving these objectives. It doesn't help to say, oh, well, tomorrow everything will be green and we'll be fine. You have to really think about what's a legitimate target and how do we achieve those. Also looking about how are you going to measure and communicate your progress. What can you do on your own and where will you need to collaborate? We saw in one of those videos earlier about the importance of collaboration. There's an increasing recognition that no one country, no one business, no one industry can achieve all of this on their own. You necessarily have to work with others. And then what is the transition decision point? And that's a question that people don't really want to talk about, but we really need to start thinking that there will be some companies, to Bruce and Ian's points earlier, there will be some companies that don't make it. And you need to, as an investor, you need to be able to identify at what point can we make that call that this company is not going to make it, and then it's about how do we close it sustainably. And the biggest question, I suppose, to ask is, why haven't you started yet? What are you waiting for, right? At this stage, I don't know what else you need other than sort of international regulators and energy agencies and the G7 commenting on what we're doing, and then local regulations and taxonomies and reporting requirements coming into place. I suppose the big thing would be, what are you waiting for? And then I'll go on to a final slide, which is really just my contact details for anybody who wants to learn more about this. Like David says, I love to talk about it and to build people's capacity in this space. I think it's incredibly relevant. But for now, if there is a minute or two for questions, I'm happy to answer any.
Thank you so much for your fantastic presentation, Nicole. We had some videos showing between the sessions, and I know the guys had to juggle them around a bit for time's sake, but there was a video which I think either played before your session or is going to play now that talks to what we can do as individuals, because change starts at home. And I firmly believe you've given a toolkit for those who have dialed in to go back to their respective homes and offices and say, what are we doing in terms of progressing our own sustainable journey, as well as participating in what that may mean. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. That's probably my shortcomings as a host. You also did my job for me, actually, and recapped all the other previous sessions so nicely. So thank you very much for that. And without a doubt, the UNPRI's loss is the advisory space's gain. So all the best in your new venture, and hopefully we will hear from you soon in that capacity.
Thank you very much.